If you've ever lived in a family home in Vancouver or its suburbs, consider just for a moment what buying and living in a home was like just after the city of Vancouver was created in 1886. We've come a long way since then. The world has changed quite a bit, and family life, of course, too. If you sometimes yearn for a simpler time, well, it certainly was a simpler time when Vancouver was just starting out. So, where is this oldest home from 1887? No, it wasn't this one. It's actually this one, today. This is the oldest picture I could find. It's about 25 years old, but it does show that the house was a classic 1880s style house. This modern building outline map shows the house, and it's a nice illustration of what happened when you tried to build your house out in the woods when there wasn't really any streets. It's hard to get the house orientated on the lot properly. So you can see this kind of indicates this is the oldest house around. It's askew. So if you're back in 1887 and you have your pick of almost all the lots in Mount Pleasant, where would you pick a lot? Well, maybe at the highest point of land in the whole of Mount Pleasant, and also maybe close to a creek, seeing how there's no water back then. Sure enough, that's what William Small did. We had this great bird's eye view of Vancouver taken for 1890. This is just 2 or 3 years of rapid growth after this little 1887 house was built, which is the home occupied by William Small and his family. Small was a carpenter at the time, and he probably built this house. It's worth $200 when he builds it. The main floor was just 500 square feet, and at the front of the house, when you came in the front door, right away there was a door into the parlor, and the parlor was sort of a formal area where you greeted strangers and anything that was really not directly family related. The rest of the house would have been private for the family. So there was really just 2 rooms on the main floor, the front parlor and the back sort of living room, dining room, family room kind of a thing. At the back there was probably built out outside the main house was a shed kitchen at some point. Upstairs you had 2 bedrooms, and at that time when he built the house there were 9 people living in these 4 rooms. That was pretty normal for the time, but remember, there was no electricity, no bathrooms, or as they say, indoor plumbing, no cars or public transit. You got around by foot, by canoe, or by horse, and there was no piped water. I should also add, this is of course the height of the Victorian era, back when people were pretty conservative about things. Certainly there was no birth control, and women were fairly restricted to staying in the home, in large part because people normally had 10 or 12 kids back then. Also, don't forget, there was no pensions, there was no workers' compensation, so if you had elderly parents who couldn't work or any relatives who were injured and couldn't work, you pretty well had to put them up and foot the bill. So how did you keep a house warm back then? Well, you would have had a wood stove in the kitchen, and you can see this is an 1880s thing with that chimney halfway up the wall. That shows you where the wood stove was. My 95-year-old neighbor was telling me that he spent a big chunk of his childhood just cutting wood for the wood stove that was in their kitchen in southeast Vancouver. I have never seen an 1880s fireplace before, and note, it is only a few inches deep, just room enough for some hot coals. There were no heating pipes at all, of course, and so to get heat to the bedrooms upstairs, there was this ceiling air vent. At night, coal would be put in this fireplace because it lasted all night, unlike wood, which would burn out in a very short period of time. Of course, people eventually built bathrooms when water lines reached that far out. In the case of this house, it was 20 years later, in 1907. Even my dad, growing up in West Point Grey in the 1910s, said that, quote, back then everyone had an outhouse and chickens. So how do we really get a sense of how long ago this was? Well, that's why we have history. The first business person had arrived just 20 years before. That was a Gassy Jack in 1867. And here is a skyline of downtown Vancouver from that year, when there was really just mostly First Nations people living here. Gassy Jack died in 1875, and that might sound like a long time ago, and yet I could have met his wife. She was still alive when I was born in Vancouver. Meanwhile, today, almost 3 million people live here in Greater Vancouver. So a city was planned out in Vancouver in 1886, and then a few months later it burned down completely. So the old gas town was completely obliterated, and the people of Vancouver started over again with a new city. The city was immediately rebuilt and exploded in growth in advance of the arrival of the first transcontinental train that arrived at Vancouver in 1887. Big surprise, real estate values skyrocketed. The lot on which the 1887 house is located was worth $25 in 1887 dollars, but that had shot up from just 10 cents just a few years before. Remember, this was a time when there were almost no houses outside of the downtown area, and this home was built relatively far out in the woods before roads were put in. The young couples in the middle class really did settle in Mount Pleasant, whereas downtown you had a lot of rich people settling in the West End and a lot of immigrants and single people living in the East End. So Mount Pleasant was really the starting point, as this 1901 map shows. In other words, Mount Pleasant was really the new gas town. When the old gas town was rebuilt, it was really just warehouses servicing the railroad and a bunch of hotels. At the Broadway Kingsway Main Heritage Heart area in Mount Pleasant, there are buildings from the 1880s, houses, and the oldest business building outside of the downtown area. In recent years, there have been calls to make Mount Pleasant, especially the Heritage Heart, a special heritage area like Gastown, Yaletown, or Chinatown have received special attention. This is a good idea because really the original part of Mount Pleasant is the new Gastown, since the old village that was Gastown originally burned down just before this house was built. It would seem like a good idea that in the future we play the heritage card and basically create a new gas town accessible to everybody that uses the Broadway Main Street corridors, and newer and better. Finally, let me point out that it's very important that not just the existing cultural heritage and heritage buildings get preserved and celebrated, but that new buildings reflect the fact it's a heritage area, as opposed to concrete, steel, and other surfaces that are later developments. And by new buildings reflecting the past, I mean the wooden buildings of the Victorian and Edwardian periods. Wood is being used more commonly today, even in higher buildings. That the yellow brick Edwardian buildings of Mount Pleasant be perhaps recognized, and even the Art Deco period, where there was a number of Art Moderne buildings in Mount Pleasant. All of these need to be looked at as a possible resource for architecture in the future. With so much generic new construction going on in Vancouver, Mount Pleasant is the perfect place to try and recapture some of Vancouver's glory days.